Good morning. Can everyone hear me okay? Sound good? I see there's a debate as to which speaker you all want to see or hear. It's always a risk going to hear the government speaker. You never know what they're going to say or how long they're going to say it. My name is Michael Hoffman. I am with the Bureau of Industry and Security's Western Regional Office. I'm based in Southern California, and it's truly a pleasure to be with you here today. How many people of you are exporters who have items that are subject to the State Department jurisdiction, defense articles and services? A couple. How many of you export items subject to the Bureau of Industry and Security, commercial items? Okay, some more. How many of you have significant export control issues when you send these items out of the country? I see someone back there that's got the trifecta going on. It is as I said, it's a pleasure to be here. Some of the speakers, I've watched them, they have taken this TED Talks thing to a true art form. And I have to say, I don't think it truly hits the strength of the federal government speaker. There we go. Okay. You might be wondering, what is the strength of a federal government speaker? What could it possibly be? Exquisite detail, PowerPoints that are poetically inspired and delivered with a grace. Not typical, but we don't do that today. It will be I'll be covering a lot of material with a broad brush, things that interest me, and I hope that they'll interest you and you'll find some level of applicability or interest to your ongoing operations. So, our agency has new legislative authority. The Bureau of Industry and Security has for years, or had for years, operated under something called the Export Administration Act of 1979. Things have changed since 1979, and the act expired back close to when John Elway retired from football. And it had been extended annually under executive order since 2001 under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. And while this worked, it wasn't necessarily the way to do business. It wasn't the way to most effectively manage the country's export control system for commercial exports. Earlier this year, Chairman Royce from the House Foreign Relations Committee put forward a bill to reestablish an authorization that later became known as the Export Control Reform Act that gave the underlying authority to what we do, offered some protections and some processes. It's a much leaner bill than what we used to operate under. Much is the same as what we used to have under the Export Administration Act, but a number of things have changed. And I'm going to talk about some of the things that are the same, some of the things that are different, and why you might care. So first, the new Export Control Reform Act that was tacked on to the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, which was also had export control implications, and I'll talk about both of these later, was then tacked on to the National Defense Authorization Act, became law in the summer of last year. So we now have authority. And what that authority does is it enables us to regulate exports, re-exports, in-country transfers, activities of U.S. persons overseas when they're engaged in supporting of proliferation activities. These are all the kinds of things that we used to do. It envisions interagency cooperation and dispute resolution so that the U.S. government has a uniform position on exports and export licensing. It envisions a world in which we operate with other countries that are like-minded with regard to export control issues, and that we minimize the number of unilateral U.S. controls, thereby putting U.S. companies at a disadvantage internationally. It continues some of the other aspects of earlier legislation that had confidentiality protection. So if you submitted documentation to the Department of Commerce, we didn't share it with other people. You had a reliance upon the fact that that information, that company proprietary information, would stay internal. We also have a continued prohibition on the use of fees for export licenses, so those will continue to stay fee-free. Now, when we talk about licensing, when we talk about export controls, there's typically the assumption that everything is controlled, and while the scope is broad on what we control between the Department of State and the Department of Commerce, not everything requires a license. That's not the slide I was hoping for. Well, not everything requires a license. We'll get to the next slide shortly, I hope, because it worked fine in practice. I'll be talking about emerging technologies, and you must be very comforted to know that this is the guy working on emerging technologies, and this is the technology he has a problem with. I suppose it's not all that inspiring, but we'll see. A very small percentage of items leaving the country actually require an export license. About 3% of the total number of items by dollar value leaving the country require a license, and that's either by the Department of State or by the Department of Commerce. So it's a fairly limited slice of the overall trade pie. Most of it goes out under something called no license required. Fairly easy, unless you're exporting to terrorist supporting countries or those countries where we have an international embargo. So that's the framework that we're working within. So what's new, and why should you care? Well, there are three aspects. My wife puts her keys down as soon as she's done with them, and she never knows where the keys are. I have set this down here. If I'm looking around and I can't seem to find something, that's what I'm looking for. Please point me in that direction. Three aspects of the new Export Control Reform Act that you might be interested in. First is the provisions that are put in place with regard to export enforcement. The Export Control Reform Act recognizes the value of an agency, of a law enforcement organization that is a single focus agency. It does one thing. It does export control issues. It doesn't do drugs. It doesn't do immigration. It does export controls. So it's highly focused, extremely knowledgeable, and the Act gives them new authorities with regard to surveillance, wiretaps, undercover operations, and even international operations. These were often done before, but had to be done in cooperation with other agencies, because our folks in enforcement didn't have the appropriate level of underlying statutory authority to do the work. So it's a vote of support for the single focus of export enforcement. The second and third elements have to do with policy and process. And they talk about, in the Export Control Reform Act, establishing a mechanism to identify and to regulate as appropriate emerging technologies. It also asks us to identify a mechanism by which we can assist small and new to export firms comply with what can be a complex or challenging set of federal regulations. So let's talk about those two provisions, the emerging technology and the small business assistance programs. So on the emerging technology front, things are different. We're operating with a different paradigm now than not too long ago, where the federal government was the driver behind much technological development. The funding came from the military services, the federal labs, came from government research institutes. Think Manhattan Project, where it was all very intensively focused on the national security side. And the technologies that were developed in the process were spun off into commercial sectors. Last year, you can see how the paradigm has changed. $530 billion in R&D expenses or R&D investments in the United States. 75% of that was from the private sector, 25% of it only from the government. That's at an historic low. So no longer is the federal government kind of at the leading edge of knowing what technologies are coming. It is seeing what's being commercialized in the private sector and seeing how those technologies can then be utilized within the national security environment. This places an increasing demand on us, those of us who are concerned about the national security interest, to identify early on those technologies before they're out and so thoroughly disseminated that they no longer offer the US a competitive advantage in the national security realm. As I talk about that level of investment, that split between private and public, not all that private sector investment is in the United States either. And while foreign direct investment is a value that helps sustain US technology and moves us forward, that investment isn't always benign. And there are countries and companies that are looking for access to acquire US origin technology to the detriment of US national interests and US corporate interests. To that end, the Export Control Reform Act looks at emerging technologies, and the other legislation that I mentioned, the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, looks at the foreign investment coming in to see whether or not additional scrutiny is required on certain types of transactions where the foreign party is interested in acquiring technology that we would rather not have widely disseminated for security purposes. So the two forms of legislation are supposed to work hand in glove, one looking at the money coming in, one looking at the technology going out. Now, I've talked about emerging technology. What does the government consider emerging technology? Is it the clicker that advances the slide? Is it something more than that? Well, to make sure that we have adequate information, we published an advance notice of proposed rulemaking back in November last year, in which we asked for industry input to help us clarify what is emerging technology and what appropriate level of regulation ought to exist on these technologies for national security reasons. So we listed broad technology categories, and it's a representative list. And here are some of the categories that were listed. One of my favorite lines is from Proverbs 24. In multiple counselors, there is security. So with the publication of this notice of proposed rulemaking, we were seeking industry input to ensure that we had those who are impacted by these regulations providing input to us so that we know what truly is at the leading edge, what can be theoretically regulated without gutting the technology base and without adversely affecting the US defense industrial base. So that was the idea. We received 230 comments. We're evaluating those now, and you should expect to see proposed rules at some point once we sort out exactly what the best course of action should be. On the second front, I'd mentioned small business assistance programs. This stuff can be hard, as those of you who've been in this a while recognize. There are some real challenges that can exist here. And to the extent that we can help those small businesses or those new to export get past some of the hurdles, the learning curve that exists at the start of the regulatory process, that's what we need to do. To that end, we developed a series of animated videos that we think help walk people through the controls in a clear and concise manner, and we hope with some level of entertainment. In several short videos, we try to get to the heart of what the controls require of companies, and we're hopeful that if you take a look at these, you or your customers or those who support your activities will benefit from being able to see this. I'd like to show you just like a 15-second clip of one of them. No, I went too far. All right, we keep missing. Can you start it from back there?
I have to ship something to my friend in the UK, and I don't know where to start.
Hello. Thank you for joining this online video. In this session, I'm going to answer your questions about U.S. export controls.
How do I know if I need an export license?
So that just gives you a little flavor of it. For those of you who've been in this business a while, you know he's in trouble, right? For those of you who pick up on microexpressions, you can see he's game, but that little twitch in his lip, he knows that it's not going to be as easy as he's hoping. But in less than 10 minutes, we hope to take him from confusion to enlightenment, and we hope to take others who watch these videos to get them just really quickly to be able to understand what all is involved, what the key factors are. And friends and family are welcome to do it. I know my family still doesn't know what I do. I've been doing this for a long time, and it's hard to get it through. Sometimes it doesn't seem as clear as we'd all like. Move this forward. Okay. So that's what it's called. This one's a quick start guide to export controls. And these are intended, as I said, to be very simple, very easy to understand. If you start watching it, it's entertaining enough that you'll stay through it and watch the whole 8 to 10 minutes. I'd like to move on now to kind of the standard business that were kind of our day-to-day business processes. One of the initiatives that was begun about 10 years ago was what was called USML to CCL. And if you take out the acronyms, it was taking items that were formerly controlled as defense articles on the US munitions list, subject to the Department of State, taking those that no longer warranted those stringent levels of controls and moving them over to the Commerce Control List, where there were more flexibilities within the system, where we had more ability to manage the process and allow transactions to go more freely. We've reviewed each of the categories. We've moved over items within the categories that can be moved over. We've done this in all but 3 categories. We've looped around and done a couple of times to make sure that we have this ongoing process for evaluating the technologies. 3 last categories to go. We're working on those, and we hope to get those out soon. So I've covered a lot of material. On that technology, moving from the USML to the Commerce Control List, I know, the people who look at this think, okay, so we used to do all of our stuff through the State Department. We learned those regulations. We know those regulations by heart. And now, in simplification, you're taking that and moving it over here. So we need to learn this new regulatory system. Great. So you've cut the red tape. You've just cut it lengthwise. We're hoping that that's not the net effect of it. We're hoping that if you found that you're involved in this process, that the steps have improved the process. And with that, I'd like to bring my comments to a close. I thank you for your patience. If you have any questions, I don't know if I have any time to take some now. I'd be happy to do so, but I will be around for a bit later if anyone has one of those questions that is truly gnarly. Yes. Do I have a target date for the publication of emerging technologies? No, we're still evaluating the comments, and we want to get it right. Typically, I would say soon. I'm not sure that we're quite there yet. But we're still evaluating the range. You'll also see something if something comes out, it will be published either an interim or proposed rule, giving business community an opportunity to comment, to make sure that we've honed this finally to get to accomplish what we want to accomplish without, handling it in a blunderbuss fashion. Are there any other questions?